What's up, Internet? Jay here with Nerd Rage Against the Machine. I thought I'd try something a little different, and in lieu of our normal live stream RPG event, we were going to just have a live stream hangout. So the idea here is I had a topic in mind, and would see if people would want to join in and discuss this. We'll see how it goes. First time doing this and all, and also, trying to get some idea of what works and what doesn't for everyone. So the topic that I've chosen today that we're going to discuss is RPG rule complexity. So when the hobby started, everyone I think has heard the story that Dungeons and Dragons started as a miniatures game called Chainmail. Chainmail was by definition kind of clunky, but typical. Its big feature was that it wasn't historical, that it had a fantasy bent. And of course, eventually this idea of taking the generals into the dungeons versus monsters became kind of a new way of playing, which it mutated into D&D. And you can see this also in the way those classes work, with like fighters being your typical infantry, wizards being basically artillery, kind of fragile, but damn can they pack a punch. Your harassment squads with like the rogue and even character classes like, say, the cleric, which is your support mechanisms. These classes kind of again represented different battlefield roles, which again became different adventuring roles. But as the hobby evolved, most competitors to D&D would point toward the cracks in the armor. Notably example would be the armor class makes you harder to hit argument. And I'm a firm agreeer with that idea. Again, it comes from miniatures wargaming. When you're dealing with 30 to 100 models on the board, you take shortcuts. You're going to make things connect as quickly as possible. So yeah, armor just makes you harder to hit and do damage. We'll just call that a day. A great example of this actually recently, well, not recently, but in more recent history, was the Starship Troopers miniatures game, which, unlike Warhammer, pardon me, unlike Warhammer, Starship Troopers had a mechanism where you didn't worry about hit. You literally, if you had a squad of 10 men armed with Merida automatic rifles, they were going to hit. They were going to hit. The question became, was the amount of damage they did sufficient to down a model? Which became the actual factor. You were just rolling for damage. You were never rolling to hit. Again, 30 rounds a second, if you will, 10 men, that's 300 rounds. And you're hitting something that is, especially an arachnid, is, 2 to 3 times the size of a human. You're probably going to at least get one straight bullet into the thing. Now, is it enough to do damage is the question. And they're not the only game that did stuff like this. But, those rules are really there, again, as representations of how we see the world of the game. But saying that, a lot of RPGs would then go on to adjust, to make more realistic choices, more realistic rules. And for a while, probably like late 70s, early 80s, it seemed like that was what a lot of RPG designers were going for, was how realistic can I make this? How much of a simulation can I make fire combat? Now, granted, this is a 90s game. It's a perfect example. Anyone who's ever read Millennium's End. Millennium's End is a percentile-based system with heavy use of firearms. It uses a shot clock system so that you actually use a template and a body type. So you have a body layer, put a clear template over the top of it, and determine where you're aiming for and then where the shot lands. And yeah, it's a great system, don't get me wrong, but as the hobby has evolved, we have now gone kind of the opposite way. We are now looking at simpler systems. A good example, I know I've probably beaten this to a dead horse that I like Star Trek, the role-playing game, but it's a really good example of how that curve has changed. Now, Adventure Gaming in the Final Frontier, the one that Michael J. Scott wrote, was actually pretty simple, but that's also because, as he stated in our live stream with him, that this was a game really designed as a small set of rules to sell miniatures. But Foss's game is a lot more complex with action points, percentiles, character creation is a lot more complex. And if you notice, the curve from that game to Last Unicorn to Decipher and now to Modiphius has dropped. I would say that, teaching new players the 2D20 Star Trek is much easier than teaching people the Fossa Trek. Now, I'm not here to say Fossa Trek bad, Modiphius good, or anything of that nature, but for those of you who disagree, it's likely because of the fact that you're so used to Fossa that it's second language. Again, so familiar with that system. I remember, in fact, I got into it once with a player years ago who was into D&D 3.5 heavily, or 3.0 heavily. He'd memorized those rules, could quote page numbers, the whole 9 yards. And I was running a game on alternate weeks, and I was running Savage Worlds, and that system just tripped him up hard. And I'm talking about, basic rolls even. Like, wait, what dice do I roll again? What dice do I roll again, man? D6, but you also get a D4 because you're a wild card. How the hell am I supposed to figure this out? Because, again, the system, while Savage Worlds is way simpler than D&D 3.0, it is also a very different system. Dice types versus stats. And if you're so ingrained in that rule set, no matter how complex it is, an alien rule set is still going to have a barrier for entry. Saying that, though, honestly, RPGs have gotten way simpler over time. And part of that is, much like computers. I work as an IT guy outside of doing this job, or doing this YouTube thing I do. And one thing I always tell people who are older, who are like, I'm afraid of computers, is, probably the biggest innovations over the last 20 years in computing haven't really been as much about power, speed, and all that. You hear that stuff, but the biggest innovations have always been in ease of entry. Compare early DOS or Unix machines, or hell, go get a Commodore 64 and just tool around with that for a while versus a Windows machine, or versus, even easier, an iPad. You had to know commands in Commodore. You had to know, kind of where you were going before you went there. Where, and again, yes, you could experiment, and experimentation was encouraged, but there's a reason that a Commodore comes with like a thick 200-300 page book, not like a rule book for an RPG. Whereas if you buy an iPad, you're probably going to get a little pamphlet and a couple of Apple stickers, and that's it. Oh, and a charger maybe. Because again, an iPad is simply touch your finger to the picture you want to go to, right? I mean, it's easier. And that's true with role-playing games as well. I think RPGs have changed to become much easier because it's one of the easiest ways to open that barrier of entry. If you're going to teach somebody an RPG and you've never played, something like Tales from the Loop is way easier to get into than, say, second ed D&D. And again, if you're somebody who has been playing second ed D&D since the day it launched, I get it. You probably have the thing memorized at this point and know where every kid is and what supplement. But again, that's the case. And, it's something I've heard a lot when bringing up different RPGs is, there is belly aching among games being too complex or too hard or too tough. In fact, I remember talking with one guy I gamed with years ago who had talked about how he was very much into the realism idea and, logistically making sense and simulation mentality. And one of his players had gotten so mad at him that they decided to start a group called PAR, People Against Reality, which he then called Parcel, People Against Reality, Choice, Effort, and Logic. And thinking on this, my whole thought is, and my philosophy has always been this: I don't believe in too hard of a role-playing game. Nothing is too complex per se. However, the question really comes down to, is it worth it? Is it worth going through this rule set to get where you're going? So I guess instead of par, sell, or par, I would be part of PFG, people for genre. And what I mean by that is that a rule set can have a complexity to it if it engages the player, if it engages the GM, if it engages the game and makes the game move forward. I'll give you a perfect example. One of my favorite systems early on was Champions / the Hero system. And the Hero system is pretty meaty. I mean, again, if we're going to compare it to D&D, D&D Second Ed would have been probably the immediate analog. You know, D&D was not anywhere near as player friendly as it is under 5th edition rules at that time. You don't believe me? A chance to bend bars, lift gates, chance to spot hidden traps, all those little weird, the modifiers that they finally codified in 3.0. But Champions appealed to me because, one, I'm a comic book nerd, but also because of the fact that while the rules were complex, they all fit together well and created a narrative. An example of this is the Knockback System. And again, this is something that if I was running a fantasy RPG or if I was running an espionage RPG, would be useless, would be a pointless gesture to throw in. But in a comic book genre, it's freaking great, man. So what it comes down to is that when you do damage, you roll, I believe it's an additional 6-sider or 2 6-siders, and you subtract that from the amount of stun damage that you get, and that's how many hexes you're thrown back. The reason for this is, again, comic book logic. How many times have you seen the Hulk punch somebody and he goes flying across the room? Which is, again, totally in service of the genre. So, yeah, it works in Champions. It works perfectly in Champions for that reason. That idea of, you hit a guy and he goes flying is really cool. Now, again, you see a good spy movie and someone punches somebody and they might drop, but they're not going to go flying across the room. I mean, that's something that's left for more elaborate games. So that's kind of where my philosophy has always come from, this idea of, if it's worth it for the game, then, we'll go through the extra trouble to learn the system. Another example I've often used in explaining my logic is I have a game that I wrote called Super Happy Sentai Hour, which is a simulation of Sentai stories, Power Rangers, Japanese superheroics. You can also throw in things like Sailor Moon, as she's kind of a Sentai meets Bishoujo kind of character or series. But I've compared it to BattleTech. So if I were, say, to run a Mech Warrior campaign, and I wanted to do the players escaping from, my group of Steiner heroes escaping from a squad of Kurita riflemen, I can imagine in a scenario which would be, probably at least a 2-hour game session of them doing a vertical chase up gantries to get to their battle mechs whilst being fired upon, and talking about the logistics of dropping grenades on the Kuritas, and of course worrying about the structural integrity of the gantries they're on. And of course, Kurita's firing back up at them and all that. This could be a really long and engaging combat. In Super Happy Sentai Hour, on the other hand, it goes something more like this. So instead of 10 Kurita riflemen, it's 100 mooks. These are the putties, the lizards, whatever, minions that the High Overlord has at his disposal. And first off, there's a rule in the game Super Happy Sentai Hour, which is that you roll a d6 to see how many of these mooks actually act this turn, which again is meant to simulate that when you see a Sentai show like Power Rangers, the fights are really more for show than anything. So you'll have one putty attack Tommy or something, and watch him spin kick the thing 4 or 5 times. Well, there's 16 other ones in the background doing like this. Ooh, we're here as a threat, but we're not going to do jack squat until this guy's at least down. So that's a rule that I came up with for Sentai Hour. On top of that, though, so we have 100 mooks versus the Sentai players, and this same being chased to your mechs would basically be them taking the turn to super leap into the mech's cockpit, and that's it. We're done. At worst, the most malicious I could do as a GM would be to roll that d6 and maybe let those moves get a parting shot. Which, if you've read the system, and again, I understand it's my system, and I'm not, yes, I'm shamelessly plugging it, but I'm not forcing you to go buy a copy. Stating that those mooks are nowhere near as powerful as PCs. So, at worst, you might get a couple scrapes, but you're going to basically make it in a turn to your mechs, and it's going to be basically, okay, I'm sacrificing an attack to do a super leap into my mech. Da-da-da-da, we're here. Versus, again, that long-winded Battletech thing. And that's not to say that Battletech is bad and Super Happy Sentai Hour is far superior. Nothing of the sort. Quite the opposite. What I'm getting at there is the fact that Battletech as a more realistic genre, as a more Game of Thrones with giant robots, where military arms and military tactics should come into play, would take longer to get to your mechs because these are more realistic. You're playing a human being, whereas Sentai is very glossed over. They defeat city-destroying monsters on a weekly basis with blithe abandon. So, yeah, the rule set and what I'm doing there should gloss over things that Mech Warrior would have you in the weeds for. Not because it's too hard or an inferior game, but because that's what you're trying to simulate. That's the genre you're simulating. Another good example I might use is comparing Traveller to Star Trek. So I'm currently in a Traveller campaign with Sean Fitzpatrick running it. Sean, you may see on here when we do our RPG live streams. Now, the last 3 sessions, and again, this may sound like I'm grousing about Traveller or Traveller sucks or something like, no, that's not what I'm getting at. But for at least the last 3 sessions, he's had a whiteboard up in the game room, and we have spent a hearty amount of time going over the route that we're taking from one part of the Sword Worlds into another. And figuring out, once we hit a location, what cargo is available. Do we have cargo? Should we get mail? Should we do this and that and the other? All these logistics for travel. Now, compare that to Star Trek. Again, your characters are orbiting Vulcan, but they have to be at Bajor. They're going to travel at the speed of plot. If it is super important as a GM that I make that travel slow, then yeah, it'll be slow. But more likely than not, if the Cardassians have decided to rabble rouse, or if a stray Borg cube has come up through the wormhole, damn straight, your ship, no matter what its war capability, will be there. It'll be there, and I'm not going to spend any time worrying about fuel consumption or warp speeds. I'm just going to basically say, yeah, the captain says punch it. Maybe you've got a couple hours to prep for the oncoming fray. But really, anyone who's ever watched a good episode of Star Trek knows that everything moves in that show at the speed of plot. So we're not worrying about, counting distances as much. And again, I'm not saying Star Trek's better than Traveller. What I'm saying is that while Traveller has us in the weeds and for trade and stuff, one, we're a highly advanced military vessel. We're paying for that fuel out of our own pockets. And on top of that, that's really what the game is about interstellar commerce, about interstellar trade, and about a more gritty, realistic answer to science fiction. So, yeah, I think that, and even though Traveller is way simpler, especially we're using the Mongoose rule set, is way simpler than some RPGs in their complexity, that is something that again is what you want to simulate. I don't think that it's too much to ask if that's the game you're playing. Additionally, two of the other big things that make games overly complex or pointlessly complex. One is and you see this a lot in older games, is the idea of rule sets that use multiple different systems for different things, i.e., here is our system for combat, but here is our system for all other task resolution. D&D is a pretty good example of this. The early D&Ds kind of felt like a Frankensteinian patchwork of different systems and ideas put together. Another example, and I'm not trying to shame any designers, I actually really appreciate this designer. I think she's wonderful. Polly Kidd created a game called Lace and Steel. And Lace and Steel, while it's a great game, I did a review on it. I think the world of that game. And honestly, the combat system in that game, it is amazing. It is, however, a very different system from all other task resolution. So when you get into a fight, you now have a completely different mindset than, say, when you're trying to sneak or when you're trying to haggle with the merchants. And so, again, one more system. Versus something like, say, again, Savage Worlds, where no matter what I'm doing, it's still going to be a task or skill resolution of some kind. Or even, a more complex RPG like Conan, where my attack is going to work the same way as my carouse. And again, this is less about bad design and more about early design. Again, we see this in a lot of technologies. Look at video gaming, where as technology has improved, things have gotten better. Compare something like the early Final Fantasies, or even like Final Fantasy VII on the PlayStation, which is heralded as a masterpiece. I'm not, again, this is for educational or academic purposes only. I'm not trying to call it a bad game. But the amount of emotion that it could convey was decent, but nothing to compare to, say, like The Last of Us or Uncharted. I always say that I remember, early PlayStation games like Tomb Raider and Resident Evil giving me some of my first jump scares. That T-Rex in Tomb Raider, holy crap, that thing came out of nowhere. But Uncharted was the first game where, and I think it was like Uncharted 3, if I'm not 4. I think it was 4. It was 4. But there's a scene, a cutscene where, I'm not trying to spoil too much, but basically, I felt like I was really watching a movie where I wasn't scared. I was more like, dude, what the hell are you doing? She loves you, you shithead. That kind of, that thing you get from a good story. And they did it well. But again, that was multiple generations later. And yes, I can feel sad about, the character, certain character's death in Final Fantasy. Yes, but it wasn't the same. It wasn't that, the humanity wasn't as there. For one, they still look like Lego blocks back then. So again, design is always evolution, I think. And we've gotten better. But I think, really, to me, I don't believe in simplicity for simplicity's sake, nor do I think complexity for complexity's sake is the way to go either. I think really, when you're designing a game and when game design is part of this, you have to look at the genre that you're emulating. And does that genre really support the kind of rules you want? Again, if you're going for gritty, then yeah, you're going to have more rules. I mentioned Millennium's End. I don't own this just to show you a paragon of bad design or something. It's a great game. This is probably one of the games I would love to run as an espionage campaign. And they did some things to speed things up. Like, when you hit a certain level of damage, just forget it. The guy's dead. Is an actual rule in here for a reason. And again, for a highly realistic espionage campaign, you're going to want that in the weeds. I mentioned Starship Troopers earlier, and I'm going to give you another fun example of this. I had purchased Aces and Eights Showdown the same week I purchased Starship Troopers. And both miniatures games, and both had almost the polar opposites, with the Starship Troopers making that rule of, well, it's not even about how much you hit. You're going to hit with that many high caliber rifles firing at that high cyclic rate of fire, you're going to hit. It's just a matter of how much damage you're going to be able to put through the unit. Whereas Ace State Showdown also used a shot clock and took time to figure out, well, if you hit the guy in the shin versus hitting the guy in the gut, what happens? And this is because it was the Wild West. Your gun had 6 shots. You were prepping every shot. You were thinking about, I want to hit Black Bart in the head. I don't want to just, spray and I don't have the luxury to spray and pray. Where in Starship Troopers, you've got a squad of men and they've all got big guns, and you spray and pray is the tactic of the day. So again, getting into the weeds is fine if that's what the genre requires. If that's what the game design requires. And that also goes true in role-playing and miniatures games and other games, I think. If you're going to make the game more, if that's really what the game is about, then that's where you really should be focusing your time. And while, yes, simpler is always better as far as ease of play, again, people get worked up in their own idea of what the best system is, and sometimes that will still, even a game like Tales from the Loop or Vossen could be too much to handle for somebody who's spent their lives memorizing the hero system or GURPS. Just tripping them up on the fact that, wait, this is really what this is how we're going to play this. It just seems a little off. Saying that, though, I do think that, we've come a long way from those early games, from those kind of prototype RPGs to where we are today. It's things have definitely evolved. I was kind of hoping to have more people to talk about that with here, but I guess I chose a bad time and did this too quickly. So I guess in the meantime, I'll bid everyone adieu. Happy gaming, and this is my live stream for the week. We will be back to do the next episode of our Vossen campaign in 2 weeks' time on the 19th. So in the meantime, I bid you adieu. Happy gaming, and take care, everyone.